I'm 74 years old, and I need to tell you something that took me almost my entire life to understand. It wasn't a tragedy. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a diagnosis or a funeral. It was a perfectly ordinary day. That's what makes it so unsettling. I woke up like I had thousands of times before. Same room, same routine, same quiet house. I made coffee the way I always did. Stood at the counter, stared out the window, watched the light move across the floor. Nothing was wrong. And yet, for the first time in my life, something felt deeply off. Not dramatic, not painful, just wrong. It was the kind of feeling you don't notice when you're young, the kind you can drown out with noise, with work, with responsibility, with movement. But when you get older, the noise fades and what's left gets louder. I remember standing there with that mug in my hands, thinking about the day ahead. There was nothing special planned, no urgency, no deadlines, no one waiting on me. And that's when the thought came. Not as a sentence, not as a realization, more like a weight. The sudden, unmistakable sense that I had arrived at the end of something without ever choosing it. I wasn't thinking about regrets. I wasn't replaying mistakes. I wasn't even thinking about happiness. I was thinking about identity, about whose life this actually was. Because when I looked back, really looked back, it felt like I'd been following instructions my entire life, quietly, automatically, without ever stopping to ask who had written them. I had done what made sense, what was expected, what people praised, and yet standing there at 74, it hit me with terrifying clarity. I had been living a life that looked right from the outside, but never fully felt like mine. That realization didn't come with tears or panic or drama. It came with a kind of stillness that's hard to describe, the kind that makes you feel exposed, like someone finally turned the lights on in a room you've been living in the dark. I started thinking about how often people had told me I was doing well. How often I had heard, "You're lucky," or "You've got it figured out," or "You should be proud." And I realized something that day that I wish I had understood decades earlier. Approval is a very quiet thief. It doesn't take things from you all at once. It doesn't hurt. It doesn't warn you. It just slowly replaces your own voice with everyone else's. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to abandon myself. I didn't consciously choose someone else's life. I just kept saying yes, kept adjusting, kept postponing questions that felt inconvenient. And year by year, without any dramatic moment, I drifted further away from whatever it was I might have been. That morning, I walked through my house and looked at it the way a stranger might. The furniture, the pictures, the shelves filled with things I once thought mattered. And I remember thinking, if someone asked me why I built this life exactly this way, I wouldn't know how to answer. That scared me more than anything else ever had. Because it meant the choices weren't really choices at all. They were defaults, and defaults are dangerous because they feel safe while they quietly decide everything for you. I don't say this as someone who failed. I had stability, I had respect, I had a life most people would call successful. But success has a way of hiding the question that actually matters. Not, did I do well? Not, did I meet expectations? Not, did I avoid mistakes? But did I live deliberately? That question didn't exist for me when I was younger, or maybe it did, and I kept stepping around it because it didn't fit into the life I was already building. It's easy to ignore a question when answering it might force you to stop. That day, standing in my kitchen at 74, I realized something uncomfortable. I had spent decades becoming someone reliable, responsible, reasonable. And somewhere along the way, I had stopped becoming myself. The strange part is, nothing in my life looked wrong enough to question. There was no crisis, no collapse, no clear moment to point to and say, that's where it went off track. Just a long, quiet accumulation of decisions that made sense in isolation, but added up to a life I never consciously chose. That was the day I understood something most people don't realize until it's far too late. You don't lose your life all at once. You lose it in pieces so small they feel harmless. And if you're not paying attention, you don't even notice they're gone. I wasn't reckless with my life. That's important to understand. I didn't drift because I was careless. I didn't make decisions blindly. I didn't ignore responsibility. If anything, I took life very seriously. From the time I was young, I did what you're supposed to do. I paid attention. I listened. I watched how people older than me lived, and I followed the patterns that seemed to work. I got an education that made sense. I chose work that was stable. I stayed where I was needed. I didn't take risks I couldn't explain. People trusted me. Employers relied on me. Family members leaned on me. I became the person others felt safe building things around. And for a long time, I believed that meant I was doing something right. I wasn't unhappy in the way people usually mean when they say that word. My life wasn't falling apart. There were no disasters to recover from. No obvious warning signs flashing in front of me. That's what made it so easy to keep going. I showed up. I handled what was in front of me. I adapted when things changed. And each time life asked me to choose between what felt familiar and what felt uncertain, I chose familiar. Not because I was afraid, or at least not consciously, but because familiarity looked like maturity. It looked like wisdom. When you're young, people praise you for being responsible. When you're older, they thank you for being dependable. I built my identity around that. Being the one who didn't rock the boat, the one who made things work, the one who didn't need much. I learned early on that approval comes quietly when you don't ask for too much. When you don't disrupt plans, when you don't insist on things that are hard to explain. So I learned how to explain myself. I learned how to justify choices I hadn't really examined. I learned how to tell convincing stories about why now wasn't the right time, why this wasn't practical, why that could wait. And people nodded. They always nodded. That reinforcement is powerful. It teaches you that as long as your life looks coherent from the outside, no one will question whether it feels coherent on the inside. I spent years believing that clarity would arrive later, that one day things would settle enough for me to ask bigger questions, that once the important obligations were handled, there would be space for something more personal. But life doesn't work like that. Responsibilities don't clear. They multiply, they evolve, they change shape. And if you build your sense of worth around being useful, there's always another reason to delay listening to yourself. I wasn't naive. I understood that life involved compromise. I just didn't realize how quietly compromise can turn into identity. I thought I was choosing stability. What I didn't see was how often I was choosing it by default. Years went by where nothing dramatic happened, just seasons repeating, projects finishing and being replaced by new ones, people aging, roles shifting slightly, but never enough to force a pause. From the outside, it looked like progress. From the inside, it felt like motion without direction. But motion is convincing. It creates the illusion of intention. As long as you're busy, no one asks where you're going, including you. That's how I lived most of my life. Not lost, not confused, just constantly occupied. I didn't ignore my inner voice. I negotiated with it, told it to wait, promised I'd get back to it later when things were calmer, simpler, more reasonable. And for a long time, that felt responsible. That's why it took me 74 years to see what was happening, because nothing ever went wrong enough to stop me. And when nothing forces you to stop, you don't realize how far you've traveled without ever deciding where you wanted to go. People often assume that realizations come from disasters, a heart attack, a diagnosis, a phone call in the middle of the night. That wasn't the case for me. What happened was quieter than that. A few months before that morning in my kitchen, I'd gone to clear out a storage unit I'd been paying for years. Boxes I hadn't opened in decades, things I kept because they belonged to a version of me I didn't want to let go of yet. Old files, old notebooks, old photographs. I didn't expect anything from it. I was just trying to be practical, reduce clutter, simplify. That's how most important moments begin, disguised as errands. I sat on the concrete floor with one of those boxes open in front of me, dust on my hands, that stale smell of paper and time. Inside were notebooks from my late 20s and early 30s. Not journals exactly, more like fragments, notes, half-written thoughts, lists of ideas that never became anything. I started flipping through them out of curiosity, and I remember feeling strangely disconnected from the person who wrote them. Not embarrassed, not amused, just distant. There were plans in those pages, ambitions I had forgotten I ever had. Questions I used to ask myself before I learned how to silence them politely. I had written about places I wanted to live, work I wanted to try, ways I imagined my life might unfold if I allowed it to. None of it was unrealistic. None of it was reckless. It was just personal. And what struck me wasn't that those plans didn't happen. It was that I couldn't remember when I stopped believing they mattered. There was no clear moment, no single decision where I said, this isn't who I am anymore. Just a slow fading. I kept turning pages, and at one point I came across a sentence I had underlined twice. I don't even remember writing it. It said something like, I don't want to wake up one day and realize I built a life that made sense to everyone but me. I sat there for a long time after that, not emotional, not overwhelmed, just still. That sentence didn't feel dramatic. It felt factual, like something obvious that I had somehow managed to forget. And what unsettled me most was this. At the time I wrote it, I was convinced I still had choices. Reading it decades later, I realized how quietly those choices had narrowed. Not because anyone took them from me, not because life betrayed me, but because I kept postponing the moment when I would take myself seriously. I packed the notebooks back into the box, closed the lid, carried everything out to my car. And on the drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just met a stranger I was supposed to become. That night I didn't sleep well. Not because I was upset, but because my mind kept returning to the same question from different angles. When exactly did I stop steering? The answer wasn't satisfying. It was gradual, incremental, unremarkable. I didn't lose my way. I surrendered it in exchange for comfort. The next morning was when it all came together. standing in my kitchen, coffee cooling in my hands, realizing that the distance between the life I imagined and the life I lived hadn't appeared suddenly. It had been built slowly, reason by reason, explanation by explanation. That storage unit didn't change my life, but it exposed something I could no longer ignore. I wasn't disappointed with my past. I was disturbed by how easily I had explained it away. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. That was the moment everything shifted, not because something ended, but because something I had been avoiding finally demanded to be acknowledged. After that morning, I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. Not new things, familiar ones. The way my days unfolded without any real decision making. How I moved from one task to the next as if the order had been written somewhere I couldn't see. I woke up, I ate, I handled what needed handling. I filled the time, and at no point did I actually ask myself why this was the shape of my life. That realization was uncomfortable because it meant I wasn't trapped. I was just following momentum. Autopilot is subtle like that. It doesn't feel like surrender. It feels like efficiency, like maturity, like knowing how the world works. You tell yourself you're being realistic, that you're prioritizing what matters, that personal questions can wait. And then one day, you look up and realize you've been waiting your entire life. I started thinking back to all the times I'd said the same things in different ways. This isn't the right moment. Things are complicated right now. Once this settles, I'll think about it. Each excuse sounded reasonable on its own. Together they built a wall. I didn't avoid my own desires. I postponed them over and over, always with a convincing explanation. That's the dangerous part. Autopilot doesn't ask you to give up who you are. It just asks you to delay being that person, and delay is easy to justify. I thought about how often I'd adjusted myself to fit what was needed, how naturally I'd stepped into roles without questioning whether I wanted to stay in them. I became reliable, predictable, low friction. Those qualities are rewarded. People thank you for them. They depend on you because of them. And slowly, without any dramatic moment, your usefulness becomes your identity. I wasn't living someone else's life because anyone forced me to. I was living it because it worked. It worked for my job, it worked for my family, it worked for the expectations placed on me. It just didn't work for whatever part of me was supposed to be choosing. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I had spent years confusing responsibility with intention. Responsibility tells you what needs to be done. Intention asks you why you're doing it. I rarely asked the second question, not because I didn't care, but because caring would have required me to slow down. And slowing down felt irresponsible when there was always something that needed attention. Autopilot thrives in that environment. It keeps you moving, it keeps you occupied, it keeps you from feeling lost. Because as long as you're busy, you feel located. But being busy isn't the same as being directed. I realized I had built a life that functioned smoothly without requiring my presence. I could disappear emotionally and nothing would collapse. The routines would continue. The roles would remain intact. The days would still pass. That thought unsettled me more than any mistake ever had, because it meant my absence wouldn't have been immediately noticeable. And if your absence doesn't change much, you have to ask yourself what part of you was ever really involved. I wasn't numb. I still felt things. I enjoyed moments. I laughed. I cared. But feeling is not the same as choosing. I let the structure of my life decide for me. And structures don't care about fulfillment. They care about stability. I had stability. What I didn't have was authorship. And once that distinction became clear, I understood why that realization hit me so hard at 74. Autopilot doesn't feel like losing control. It feels like being competent. Until you realize you've been living a life that would have unfolded almost the same way without you consciously participating in it at all. Once I started seeing my own life more clearly, something else happened. I began to recognize the same pattern everywhere, not in extreme cases, not in broken lives, in ordinary people, successful ones, responsible ones, people who were doing fine, friends I'd known for decades, colleagues, neighbors, even strangers I'd talk to briefly and then forget. They all sounded familiar. Someone would say they were tired, but not in a physical way. Another would joke about how fast time was moving. Someone else would talk about retirement as if it were a finish line where life finally begins. I'd nod along. I always had. But now I was listening differently. I started noticing how often people described their lives as if they were temporary arrangements, as if the real version of their life was waiting somewhere in the future, after the kids are grown, after this phase passes, after things calm down, after I figure a few things out. Everyone seemed to be living in preparation for something that never quite arrived. I thought about people I'd worked with over the years, men and women who were admired for their discipline, their consistency, their ability to handle pressure. People who never caused problems, never took detours, never disrupted the rhythm. They were praised constantly. And then years later, I'd hear small things. A quiet divorce, a sudden health scare, a retirement that felt emptier than expected. Nothing dramatic enough to be called a tragedy, just a sense of something unresolved. I remembered conversations I had had with people my age, usually late at night after enough time had passed for honesty to slip through. They'd talk about things they never did, lives they almost lived, versions of themselves that existed briefly and then disappeared under responsibility. And what struck me was how similar the language was. No one said, "I made a terrible choice." They said, "It just happened." That phrase stayed with me. It just happened, as if a life unfolds on its own, without participation, as if decades can pass without anyone actively deciding how they should feel inside them. I started thinking about how often we confuse movement with direction, how easily we assume that because time is passing, something meaningful must be happening. But time doesn't guarantee meaning. It only guarantees change. I saw it in younger people too, especially younger people. They were busier than we ever were, more informed, more connected, more overwhelmed. They spoke about burnout like it was a personality trait, about anxiety like it was weather, about dissatisfaction as if it were just part of being functional. And when I listened closely, I heard the same quiet assumption I'd lived with for decades, that this wasn't the real life yet, that this was just the phase you endure until things make sense, that someday clarity would arrive. But clarity doesn't arrive on its own. It has to be chosen. And choosing requires space, attention, willingness to disappoint expectations. Most people never get around to that, not because they're weak, not because they don't care, but because the world rewards adaptation more than authorship. It rewards people who fit, who adjust, who don't ask too many uncomfortable questions. I wasn't special in how I drifted into this life. I was typical. And that was the most disturbing realization of all. Because it meant this wasn't a personal failure. It was a common outcome, a quiet one, a respectable one, the kind that doesn't look like loss until you're old enough to recognize what's missing. I started seeing my own life as part of a larger pattern, one that repeats generation after generation. People inherit expectations. They learn how to perform stability. They build lives that function. And somewhere along the way, the question of whether it feels true gets quietly removed from the equation, not by force, by neglect. And that's when I understood something that still unsettles me. Most people don't abandon themselves because they choose the wrong life. They abandon themselves because they never stop to choose at all. When people talk about regret, they imagine big failures, careers that collapsed, relationships that exploded, decisions that clearly went wrong. That's not how regret actually works, at least not the kind that stays with you. The regrets that hurt the most don't announce themselves as mistakes. They arrive quietly, disguised as reasonable choices, sensible delays, practical compromises. They don't look dangerous in the moment. They look responsible. I don't lie awake thinking about things I did wrong. Those memories have edges. They're contained. You can place them in the past and say, that was a bad call, and move on. What lingers are the things that never became anything. The conversations I kept postponing because there was always time later. The afternoons I said no to without thinking because I was tired or busy or already committed to routines I didn't question anymore. The invitations that felt slightly inconvenient, so I declined them, assuming there would be another chance. There usually wasn't. I think about people who were once close to me and slowly became distant, not because of conflict, but because of neglect. We didn't argue, we didn't fall out. We just stopped showing up for each other in small ways. At the time, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like life. I remember a friend I used to walk with in the evenings. Nothing special, just slow walks around the neighborhood, talking about ordinary things, complaining, laughing. One year, work got heavier. I skipped a few walks, then a few more. Eventually, the habit disappeared. We still said we should do it again sometime. We never did. Years later, I heard he'd moved away. And what struck me wasn't sadness. It was the strange realization that I couldn't remember when the last walk happened. There was no ending, just absence. That's how most meaningful things disappear. Not with a final moment, but with the assumption that they'll always be there. I regret the questions I didn't ask because they felt too personal, too awkward, too unnecessary at the time. I regret the times I chose efficiency over presence, when I listened just enough to respond, but not enough to understand. I regret how often I treated people I loved as constants instead of miracles. I thought relationships were durable by default, that they could survive long stretches of inattention as long as there was no major damage. I was wrong. Connection erodes quietly, and you don't notice it until you realize you're standing next to someone you've known for decades and have no idea what's happening inside them. I think about moments that could have changed something if I had stayed with them a little longer. A conversation that ended too soon. A thought I dismissed because it felt impractical. A feeling I labeled as unrealistic and moved past. None of those moments felt decisive. That's why they haunt me, because I didn't fail in them. I opted out, over and over in ways so small they barely registered. There were times I sensed a restlessness in myself, a quiet dissatisfaction that didn't have a clear cause. Instead of listening to it, I managed it. I added structure. I added routine. I added explanations. I told myself I was just going through a phase, that everyone feels this way sometimes, that it wasn't worth disrupting a stable life over vague discomfort. So I learned how to live with that discomfort. I normalized it. And once something becomes normal, you stop questioning it. That's what I regret most, not the discomfort itself, but how easily I accepted it as permanent. I regret how often I waited for certainty before acting. I told myself I'd move when I was sure, change when I was ready, speak when I had the right words, but certainty doesn't come before action. It comes from it. By waiting, I wasn't being cautious. I was avoiding responsibility for my own life. I look back now and see how many of my regrets share the same shape. They're all built around the assumption that time was abundant, that opportunities would repeat, that people would remain available, that energy would return, that interest would last. Time proved me wrong, not dramatically, relentlessly. There are places I wanted to go that I never went to because the timing was never ideal. There are versions of myself I wanted to explore that I kept postponing because they didn't fit neatly into the life I already had. I thought I was being patient. What I was really doing was letting momentum decide for me. I regret how often I chose comfort over curiosity. Comfort doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like relief, like avoiding unnecessary trouble. But over decades, comfort becomes confinement. It narrows your world without ever closing the door outright. You don't notice the loss because nothing is taken from you. You just stop reaching. I regret how rarely I asked myself whether the life I was maintaining was still worth maintaining. I treated stability as an unquestionable good, something to protect at all costs. I never asked what it was costing me. And then one day, much later than I'd like to admit, I realized something that still hurts to say out loud. The life I worked so hard to preserve had quietly replaced the life I once wanted to live. Not because it was better, but because it was easier to explain. That's the kind of regret you can't fix. You can't go back and insert intention where there was none. You can't reclaim years spent drifting without ever deciding. You can only see them clearly after they're gone. And seeing them clearly is what makes it so heavy. Because you understand with painful precision that nothing stopped you except the belief that there was no rush. There was. There always was. After all that thinking, all that looking back, I expected the answer to be complicated. I assumed it would be something abstract, some hard-earned philosophy that only makes sense after decades of living. It wasn't. The truth was almost embarrassingly simple. My life didn't drift because I lacked discipline. It didn't lose direction because I wasn't capable. It didn't become someone else's life because I was weak. It drifted because I stopped paying attention to what felt quietly wrong. Not painfully wrong, not urgently wrong, just off enough to be inconvenient to address. I thought meaning would announce itself, that one day I'd wake up with clarity, with certainty, with a clear sense of what mattered most. That never happened. What mattered was always there. I just kept walking past it because it didn't demand immediate action. I misunderstood what a meaningful life actually looks like. I thought it would feel decisive, clear, confident. Instead, meaning shows up as small signals, subtle discomfort, questions that don't have answers yet. It asks for curiosity before it offers certainty. I ignored those signals because they were easy to ignore. They didn't disrupt my schedule. They didn't threaten my stability. They didn't force a decision, so I learned to live without them. And here's the part that took me the longest to accept. A life can be completely functional and still be misaligned. You can do everything right and still feel like you're living slightly sideways. That feeling isn't a flaw, it's information. I spent years treating it like background noise, something to manage, something to override with productivity or explanation. But it was the only honest feedback I was getting. Nothing dramatic was missing from my life, no crisis, no chaos, no obvious mistake. What was missing was participation. I wasn't actively choosing how I wanted to feel inside my own days. I let structure take over that role. And structures don't ask whether you feel connected to the life they maintain. They just keep going. The truth is, a meaningful life isn't built through big moments. It's built through alignment, through the quiet agreement between what you're doing and what you value. And that agreement doesn't stay in place automatically. It has to be renewed, revisited, protected. I thought once you set your life on a certain path, it would carry you forward in the right direction. It doesn't. Paths don't care where they lead. They just make movement easier. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it with clarity. Nothing was stolen from me. I handed it over slowly in exchange for certainty, comfort, and approval. And those things delivered exactly what they promised: stability. What they don't deliver is meaning. Meaning requires presence, attention, the willingness to feel slightly uncomfortable in order to stay honest. That's what I missed, not opportunity, honesty. I don't have advice for you, not in the way people usually mean it, because advice assumes I know what you should do with your life, and I don't. But there are questions I wish I had asked myself earlier, not to answer immediately, just to let them exist long enough to be uncomfortable. I never asked myself whether the life I was living actually reflected what I cared about. I assumed it did because it looked respectable, because it made sense, because it didn't raise concerns. But respectability is not the same as alignment. I wish I had paused even once and asked, if no one else had expectations of me, would I still be making these same choices? Not to change anything on the spot, just to notice the answer. I never asked myself how often I felt like I was waiting for things to settle, waiting for permission, waiting for the right version of myself to arrive. Waiting can feel responsible, but waiting without intention turns into avoidance. I wish I had asked myself when I stopped being curious about my own life, when I started assuming that who I was at one stage should permanently define who I'd be at all the others. I wish I had asked whether the roles I was performing still fit me, or whether I was just used to them. Because comfort can disguise misalignment for a very long time. I never asked myself what parts of me were getting quieter each year. What interests I stopped mentioning because they felt impractical. What thoughts I learned to dismiss because they didn't lead anywhere obvious. Those things don't disappear. They wait. I wish I had asked myself whether I was choosing my days or simply managing them. There's a difference. Managing keeps things running. Choosing gives them direction. And one can exist without the other for decades. I never asked myself what I was protecting so carefully. Stability, approval, a version of myself that made sense to others. Protection can become a prison if you never question what you're guarding against. I wish I had asked myself how much of my life was built on default. Not on desire, not on intention, just on momentum. Because momentum feels neutral, harmless, inevitable, until you realize it has carried you somewhere you never consciously wanted to go. I don't ask these questions to unsettle you. I ask them because they were always there, waiting. And the only reason they felt uncomfortable is because they mattered. I'm 74 now. That number feels different when you say it out loud. Not heavy, not frightening, just precise. When you're young, time feels abstract, elastic, something you spend without noticing, something that seems to replenish itself. At this age, it doesn't feel abstract anymore. It feels counted. I don't wake up every morning thinking about death. That's not how it works. Most days feel ordinary, quiet, familiar. But underneath that ordinariness, there's an awareness that never fully leaves. Not panic, just clarity. There are fewer blank pages ahead than behind me, fewer chances to drift without consequence, fewer opportunities to pretend that later is guaranteed. Time stops being a background element at some point. It steps into the room. I look at my days differently now, not because they're dramatic, but because I know they're limited. Each one carries weight simply by existing. I notice how easy it still is to slip back into autopilot, how familiar the old habits feel, how natural it is to fill time instead of inhabit it. That tendency doesn't disappear with age. If anything, it gets stronger because routine feels safe. And safety feels comforting when the horizon shortens. But I also know now what that comfort costs. I've lived long enough to see how quietly years disappear when you don't hold them consciously. How easily a life can remain intact while something essential fades. I don't think about what I might have been anymore. That kind of thinking doesn't help. What I think about is attention, about staying present enough to notice when a day is slipping past me without participation, when I'm moving through hours without actually being there. Because that's how it happens, not all at once, not dramatically, just a day at a time. I don't measure my life now by productivity or outcome. I measure it by whether I was awake inside it, whether I noticed the conversations I was having, whether I felt connected to what I was doing, whether I chose my actions instead of defaulting into them. That awareness didn't arrive early for me. It arrived late, but it arrived clearly. And clarity, even when it comes late, changes how you experience what remains. I don't know how much time I have left. No one ever does, but I know this. The life I'm living now feels like mine in a way it didn't before. Not because it's perfect, not because it's impressive, but because I'm present for it. Time keeps moving. It always will. The only real question is whether you move with it deliberately or let it carry you somewhere without asking. I spent many years letting it carry me. I notice it now. That's what 74 gave me, not answers, awareness. And once you have that time stops being something you assume you have. It becomes something you actually live inside.